Hi, I'm Emily Von Hassen from Lake and Glade Counseling, and I just wanted to make a video describing the contents of the blog post that I just wrote about depersonalization, derealization in its prolonged chronic state. I know that a lot of folks who are going through episodes of depersonalization and derealization can find it difficult to read, and artificial light, like screens, can be pretty triggering for the experience. So I wanted to include a video, and you're welcome to just turn off the screen and just listen to the audio if that makes it more accessible for you. So yeah, I made this post because I've been researching depersonalization and derealization for a long time, like about 12 years now. And if you've looked for research about DPDR in its prolonged state, I'm sure you know that it's finding research and treatment that works and that has been shown to work is few and far between, but it does exist. So anyways, I was just compiling a bunch of the research that I have found into like a coherent post for myself, for my own use as a clinician. And I just thought it might be helpful to people because I know it's a common experience to be in an episode and be frantically searching for things, and it seems pretty fragmented. So yeah, I thought it might be helpful. I'm going to take you through everything I talk about in the post, and I'll put the timestamps in the description, so you're free to just skip ahead if there's parts that you already know about or you're not as interested in. Sorry, there's a bird really close to my window. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about definitions, like formal definitions in the mental health community, and then I'm going to talk about self-reports of the sensations and the lack of sensations that are common with the experience. Kind of the progression of how it's been understood in the mental health field, how it's often experienced with other disorders or challenges, other things that can be experienced along with it. And then I get a little bit more into treatment. So because this was on my website, I do talk about my own therapeutic approach for working with it. But in this video, I'm going to try to make it as like applicable to you, so in ways that you can use for yourself as well, because I know it can be tough to find help with this depending on where you live. So yeah, I'll talk about this more at that part, but I talk about hyperreflection, existential therapy, which is my foundation, cognitive-behavioural therapy, which has been shown to help. So, and this can be translated into ways that you can apply into your daily life as well. Although it's not a substitute for therapy. Therapy is always the ideal method to take, just because it works with where you are on a given day, and it can work with your individual needs much more than a blanketed statement video like this can serve. Yeah, so I talk about that. And then I go into a free exercise that uses a lot of the findings that I talk about in this. This exercise is really close to my heart because it's modified from one that I did for years when I was experiencing my own prolonged depersonalization episode. And I've modified it based on research that I found since, but it was cool for me to enter this field and learn about the treatment that has been helpful, and to see how basically what my therapist was getting at with getting me to do this exercise on an ongoing basis. So I hope that can maybe be helpful to someone else as well. And then I have a part at the end where I give some tips for how to find resources in your own area. I know a lot of people get tripped up by if there's no one specializing in dissociation, depending on where you live, and this can be really discouraging. And I'm going to talk about this quite a bit, about how it's not understood in the general public compared to a lot of other mental health struggles or disorders. But there are some tidbits I have, I guess, to give you that may offer some suggestions for how to find resources in your area still, for things you may not have known to look for. Yeah. All right, so starting with the formal definitions. So depersonalization and derealization are perceptual disturbances that are experienced by approximately 23% of people as short-lived experiences. So this is when it's like in response to a clear, stressful situation. And yeah, this brief experience of depersonalization and derealization is gaining visibility in the mental health community and to a certain extent in the general public, but the prolonged chronic presentation that isn't tied to a specific incident is still very under-researched and understood. But that being said, it's still picking up. There are some approaches that have been shown to help, and research is developing, so I'm going to get into that later. Yeah, also, it's very common for depersonalization and derealization to be experienced at the same time. It isn't always, but just like for the sake of my not having to say a tongue twister for the next hour, how long this takes, I am going to say DPDR. But if you only experience one, DPDR is depersonalization, derealization. But if you only experience one, the other, the most information I give is still relevant. So you can just kind of adjust that yourself. Yeah, so the DSM-5 is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And it's kind of the book where all of the mental disorders are kept in one place for therapists, psychologists, doctors, all that. So the formal definition in there of depersonalization disorder, or depersonalization derealization disorder, is kind of in line with like prolonged chronic episodes, basically, like not just tied to a specific incident, but happens on an ongoing basis. And the definition for depersonalization is experiences of unreality, detachment, or being an outside observer with respect to one's thoughts, feelings, sensations, body, or actions. So examples are perceptual alterations, distorted sense of time, a sense of an unreal or absent self, and or emotional and physical numbing. So depersonalization, put simply, is the sense of the self not being real. So you feel like you don't exist. And derealization is similar, but for the surroundings. So a feeling of the world or your outside world not existing. And the formal definition for this is experiences of unreality or detachment with respect to surroundings. So example being individuals or objects are experienced as unreal, dreamlike, foggy, lifeless, or visually distorted. So yeah, those are the formal definitions. And now I'm going to talk about self-reports of the sensations or lack of sensations of the experience. I'm starting with this before getting into how it's understood in the mental health field, because this is where people usually start. If you experience a prolonged episode, whether tied to a clear event or not, because this experience is so misunderstood or like not understood at all really in the general public, it's often experienced in isolation. And it's really common for people to say that they believe they're the only people feeling this, for people to go a really, really long time without getting validation from a healthcare professional of some sort, of what they're going through. In fact, in one study that I looked at, the average duration of experiencing one of these episodes before getting in contact with a specialist who validated the experience was 12 years. To be fair, part of this is because there's just so few specialists in the first place, but yeah, it's still, to put mildly, a very isolating experience to go through if you're one of those people who feels like no one else is going through it. And yeah, so a lot of the research is in self-reports of this, because that's what people know the best at first usually. So yeah, in 1935, so a long time ago, a woman named Mare Gross is her last name. She recorded self-reports from people who were in one of these episodes. And something that is so fascinating to me is that, like, this was almost 100 years ago now, and self-reports of the sensations and the lack of sensations with depersonalization, derealization have stayed remarkably similar over the last century, and they're described in such similar ways among self-reports, which is just so interesting to me, because they're often experienced in isolation, like I was just saying. So this isn't people building off of each other's descriptions. And also the experience of depersonalization and derealization is so difficult to describe because it feels so strange. So yeah, this consistency of description is super, super fascinating to me. And I think it really points to a high level of self-awareness that is present in people who experience this. And I'll get more to that later. But yeah, description is very similar, and not just in vague ways like I feel fake or not real, but very specific experiences. Some of these include looking at your hands and feeling like they don't belong to you. People analogizing the experience by saying it's like everyone is playing a role on a stage and I'm just a spectator. A feeling of metaphorical fog. So it's like as if things are foggy around you, but they're not actually. And also the image of the self existing in the back of your head. So you're in the back of your head watching your body act. Yeah, those are some of the really specific and consistent definitions. And one thing that's important to note with this experience, because it involves a sense of not existing or the world not existing, there's still a clear grasp of reality at the same time. So the people going through this know what is real and what isn't. So it's different from psychosis or schizophrenia in that way, where there isn't an actual break in the sense of reality, but it still feels like it's not real. So it's a really, really conflicting and scary experience to hold. One way that I like to describe it that I think makes it a little clearer is it's like you know what's real and what isn't, but your body doesn't believe you. Yeah. So it's very, yeah, very unsettling to go through that. And because there's a clear sense of reality, but also feeling like you and or the world is not real, there's often a there's often a fear of going crazy is usually the words. People often worry that they're going to go crazy, or at some point it's going to lead to a break in reality and no longer being able to tell the difference between what's real and what isn't. Just for some validation, I guess. That's usually not the case. It usually doesn't lead to something like psychosis or schizophrenia, but I mean, the fear is so understandable because it's such a, yeah, feeling detached from yourself and your surroundings is such a scary thing to go through. It's a very rational place in my mind to go to have that fear. Other common fears are having permanent brain damage, like having switched something in your brain that you can't reverse, and you're going to be like that forever. Yeah, okay. And then some other self-reports for the experience, starting with the internal experience, it's feeling like a robot, feeling separate from yourself, or like your head is full of cotton wool. Some self-reports of the feeling of detachment from the body has been feeling like you have a phantom body, saying nothing affects me, or feeling like you're sleepwalking. Or in extreme cases, it's been described as feeling like the Walking Dead. And in terms of the surroundings, common descriptions are, it's as if the surroundings are painted, not natural, or two-dimensional. Another experience that's really common with this is because it feels like you're detached from yourself, kind of watching your body live its life and do its actions. There can be a very unsettling feeling of feeling like you're not controlling your own actions and like you're not actively deciding what you're doing. And this can also make it very difficult to describe to people around you, because it's almost like you kind of go on autopilot and your actions can look very normal, like in relation to what your actions were before the episode to people around you. So if you try to describe it to people, you might not feel very validated because the people might be thinking, well, you're acting the same. But that doesn't make it any less of a disturbing experience for you personally. And in fact, that actually can add to how disturbing it can feel and how alienating it is to have people not understand it, to feel like you can't describe it because you're acting in a way that doesn't match up with your internal experience. Yeah. It's also important to say that this isn't the fault of the people around you. Unfortunately, depersonalization and derealization in its prolonged state is not understood by the general public. So it's not the fault of the individuals for not understanding, but that doesn't make it less hurtful, unfortunately. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how prolonged DPDR is understood in the mental health field. Starting by not talking about prolonged DPDR, but saying that I mentioned this in the beginning, that it's becoming more understood in its brief presentation of being tied to like a threatening or traumatic event where you'll temporarily dissociate or become depersonalized. And this is because of the body's fight, flight, or freeze mode that it goes into when faced with threatening events. So put simply, if you're in a situation and it becomes a life-threatening situation, your body and your brain goes through like near instantaneous physiological changes to prepare you to either fight off the threat or flee to a place that is safe and you're not in danger from this threat. Or those are the ones that are the most understood. But there's also the freeze response, which is when this is born from the ancient strategy of playing dead so that the predator will go away and not hurt you. And this is the one most attributed to depersonalization and derealization because it kind of involves your body and your mind shutting off in a sense, which is what a lot of people describe DPDR as feeling like you're shut off. So yeah, in the brief presentation, that's usually how it's understood. And this could still explain part of the prolonged presentation as well. Like I said, there needs to be more research to know this for sure, but this is a theory that is one of the more focused, is kind of like there's more of a consensus on that theory over the other ones, basically. So I talked about the woman in 1935 named Maya Gross who did who collected the self-reports of people who experienced DPDR in a prolonged state. And she wrote that she theorized DPDR is a performed response of the brain that is a normal response to threat that becomes fixed and maladaptive in some individuals. And yeah, like I said, this is still a theory that's supported among some healthcare professionals, which it basically just means that the prolonged state of DPDR could still be tied to the freeze response of trauma, but maybe the freeze response was internalized in a way so it didn't happen immediately at the time of a traumatic event, or it wasn't just one really traumatic event. It could also be like a series of mildly traumatic events that was just very stressful for a prolonged period of time. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but yeah, basically it's saying that it could still be the freeze response, but it was internalized and kind of lost its context. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to talk now about other experiences or disorders that are common with DPDR, starting with experiences. Emotional abuse is one of the most common experiences with this. Other types of abuse are also present sometimes, like physical and sexual abuse, but those are more often attributed with more severe forms of dissociation, like dissociative identity disorder. Emotional abuse is the one most commonly found in people who experience prolonged episodes of DPDR. It can also hit after prolonged periods of severe stress or adjustment. Like I was just saying, a lot of the time people go through this and they're kind of racking their brain because they hear about how it's tied to trauma and they're thinking, well, I didn't have like one particularly traumatic event, or I wasn't even abused or they don't feel that they were abused, and it can feel like there's no real basis for the experience. But even if you went through a very prolonged period of stress or adjustment, your body can still have that response where it feels like it's overloaded and needs to shut off and can lead to this sense of disconnection. So that's possible. And so when talking about other disorders or experiences, I say disorders or experiences because some people don't like using the word disorders, like depression and anxiety. They don't like wording, or even depersonalization. They don't like wording that as disorders, because a lot of the time they're very normal reactions to situations that we face. So it's not really maladaptive at all. But at the same time, some people really like calling it disorders because it can validate the experience, knowing that it fits into a category that other people experience and that's recognized. So it's a very personal thing, but I just wanted to explain that that's why I keep saying disorder/experiences to make room for both. So yeah, if you do experience another disorder along with DPDR, it usually feels like one is primary and one is secondary. Not always, but often, which basically means you feel like one is the one you struggle with the most and the other one is symptomatic of that. So examples of that could be if you feel like you struggle with depression the most, but you experience DPDR episodes when you're in really stressful situations, so you'll dissociate for periods of time, then your primary disorder or experience would be depression and the secondary one would be DPDR. On the other end, you could experience DPDR as the primary one and feel like it leads to anxiety towards, like you could develop anxiety around the idea of socializing or interacting with the external world. And some of the disorders that are most common with DPDR are anxiety, depression, phobias, and obsessive compulsive disorder, which a lot of people call OCD for short. Prolonged depersonalization, derealization episodes can be acute or gradual, which basically means gradual means they come gradually. So you can have short experiences, short and like unsevere, I guess, experiences of DPDR that come in on a recurring basis with stressful situations. They might get longer or more severe and then eventually go into one long episode. Or it can be acute and it can just hit all at once all at once at a time. And sometimes it's not even, like I said, it's not even at a time that is a threatening situation in your mind. It can just hit out of nowhere. And when that happens with people, sometimes they remember the exact setting where it happened. And it can also be triggered by drug use, especially marijuana. So I think I skipped past this in one of the early slides, unfortunately, but one of the most popular online communities for reaching out about DPDR is, I know what it is, but I'm just going back so that I don't say it wrong by accident, is dpselfhelp.com/forum is where the forum is. But yeah, this is where people can talk about their own stories, corroborate their own experiences, talk about treatment that has or hasn't worked for them. But there's a large population of people on here talking about their episodes being triggered by marijuana. Yeah. Okay, so that was kind of my description of the experience of it, how it's understood in the mental health field. Now I'm going to start talking about what can be done about it. Keep in mind, this is all from a therapeutic standpoint. I don't know anything about, well, not nothing, but I don't know much about medication because that's not my area. So you would need to talk to a doctor about those things, but my area is more about what therapy helps and what in that therapy is helpful. So I try to translate it into something that you can use yourself as well. While saying, again, it's not a substitute for therapy. Therapy is always the ideal if you can access it, but not everyone can. So it's important to give these as well. So I was talking earlier about how endlessly fascinating it is to me that self-reports are so similar, even when these episodes are experienced in isolation from each other. And even though the descriptions are even though the experience is so difficult to describe, and how I think this really points to a high level of self-awareness that people who go through DPDR have. This sounds contradictory because the experience feels like the opposite of awareness because there's such a sense of detachment, but it really is a sense of awareness towards the sense of detachment at the very least. And I do see this ultimately as a strength that just needs to be redirected. So yeah, to make this a little clearer, one of the things that can actually perpetuate or keep the experience of prolonged DPDR going is what the literature calls philosophical rumination loops, which is basically like asking yourself totally understandable existential questions like, if I don't feel real, what's the point of living? What's the meaning of life if the world doesn't even seem real or like it exists? Like, just what's the point, basically? Very existential questions, huge questions, but totally understandable questions to ask if you feel like you're detached from yourself and the world. So I just really want to normalize asking those questions in the first place. I can't see how anyone couldn't. I remember being in loops like that for a very long time, but if you've been through them yourself, you probably know how continuous they can be. They just kind of go in a circle and they're just kind of like an internal spiral within you. And they can even become repetitive or intrusive. And yeah, this is one of the things that can perpetuate the experience. And it can also lead to self-monitoring or self-observation that can become obsessive. So like constantly scanning your body for some sense of connection or sensation. Again, totally understandable. If you feel like you can't feel anything, of course you would want to try to find some sign of connection that you could build off of. And it feels counterintuitive to try to break that cycle, but you have to do it because that's one of the things that's been shown to help. And yeah, Viktor Frankl, he was a philosopher who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and he was responsible, or he had a huge role in developing the field of existential therapy. It's just a fun fact. But he had a concept that he described, or that he called hyper-reflection, which I haven't seen drawn specifically to DPDR before, but it's pretty much what I just described. His definition of it was when someone is so attentive to an issue that their attention affects their life and actually perpetuates the issue. And yeah, this is one of the main things that therapists do to help DPDR. And the exercise that I provide tries to tackle this in ways that you can practice yourself. Okay, so like I said, I talk a bit about my approach in my post. I'm going to try to stay away from that a little bit in this because I know people are watching from all over the world. But yeah, my foundational approach is existential therapy, specifically existential analysis, which it just focuses on the meaning of life at its core, is the simplest way to put it. So it's striving for a life of personal meaning and inner consent. So inner consent basically just means finding some sense of saying yes to living and feeling like you're not just being tossed around by circumstance, finding some way to live intentionally, even if it's a very small thing that you currently have control over, because the fact is we don't have control over a lot. So much of the experience of DPDR feels like not having control. So it's about finding the tiniest things, even if it feels contrived and fake at first. So the reason that I use this approach, aside from what I just said, is also because I feel like it gives space and validation to what I believe is an existential crisis that's at the core of the DPDR experience. And like I said before, those philosophical rumination loops that can perpetuate the experience, they need to be addressed, but it doesn't change the fact that it's an existential crisis that's at the center of this. So my approach is about validating that and containing it, but redirecting the energy to the outside world in small steps that are manageable, because it can be extremely terrifying to try to foster that connection when it just doesn't feel present. So yeah, it's about doing it in small steps and not dwelling on the existential questions. while still valuing them, of course, and trying to find ways to make your life meaningful. This can also be really helpful if you have experienced emotional abuse, which can be so common with it. Like reclaiming your own meaning can be incredibly powerful if that's what you've experienced. And also, depending on your experiences, processing trauma may be part of this as well. I'm going to talk about that a little more later when I talk about finding resources. One of the approaches that has been found to be the most similar as well is cognitive behavioral therapy, so CBT for short. There was a study done that used this to break those cycles of self-monitoring that I was talking about, like self-monitoring and self-observation. When this approach is used to help break those cycles, it at least gets rid of the part of the experience that is perpetuating DPDR. And I mean, the results of this study were pretty amazing. The average span of feeling or going through one of these episodes is 14 years. So yeah, the average was most people were going through this for around 14 years, which is an incredibly long time. And dissociative symptoms decreased when it was worked with through CBT. And I think the number, actually I know the number, I checked before, it was 28% of people no longer fit the definition of depersonalization derealization disorder 6 months after the study, which is pretty amazing after 14 years of going through this. And it's just a study. Like, imagine what more treatment could have done. So I'm just saying all this to say that it can feel really hopeless when going through this and getting little validation from people around you and not seeing much in terms of places to turn for help. But there is hope in the research. So that's what I'm getting at. I also think that, kind of in line with what I was saying about redirecting the self-awareness that's already there, but is usually internal, and trying to redirect it in tolerable amounts to the external world. I also see that as redirecting strength that I really, really fundamentally believe everyone going through DPDR already has. Going through something like this and feeling totally alone in it, and all the fear that's associated with it, and the indescribable experience. I really, really, really believe it takes an incredible amount of strength just to live your life while going through that. So, therapy can be about redirecting that strength and also honoring it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my exercise that I made for everybody and share my screen. I'm doing this on Zoom, so I hope it works. Great. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. Like I said at the beginning, this was based on an activity that I did for years when I was going through my prolonged episode in my late teens to early adulthood. I've altered it a little bit based on the research that I've done. But the first point is to try to pick a location to go to that has easily observable objects, and ideally a location that you have felt connected to in the past. So for me, this was nature. I grew up feeling really connected to nature, and then when my episode hit, I would avoid it because the sense of loss was so strong when I would go there. It was just it upset me so much that I couldn't connect to it anymore, that I would avoid it. And now we know that avoiding places because of this actually reinforces DPDR. So it's about gradually confronting that fear in amounts that aren't going to totally overwhelm you, but in small amounts. So like I said, for me, this was outside. For you, maybe it was like art museums, cafes, anything like that. Pick a place that isn't going to have the triggers that you have. So common ones are artificial light and crowds, but you know what yours are the most. And you want it to be, like I said, it's a place that you're avoiding. So you want it to be uncomfortable to be there, but not debilitating. So if you think of how challenging it is to go to this place on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being neutral, not bothering you at all, 5 being barely uncomfortable, and 10 being totally debilitating, can't cope. Pick a 6, so a place that feels a little uncomfortable. Okay, and then what you're going to do is in this place, focus on one object at a time and just notice the physical details about it and write them down. So it's really common when doing this for the first things to come up being your like sense, the distorted perception, right? So noticing how unreal it looks or how far away it looks or how it looks not natural or painted. So try not to notice or don't notice those parts, you know, like just notice the objective appearance of it. Example being the branch has many dark green pine needles, raindrops hang off the bottom, and the top half is in yellow sunlight. So yeah, that's just objective what it looks like. It's not talking about how it's green but it looks far away, or it's in yellow sunlight but the sunlight looks like it's painted. Like, no, just the objective physical aspects of it. And then for the second part of the activity, if you do notice any sensations in your body or your body react to the environment in any way, like in temperature, you can feel the wind, anything like that, write it down. Same with emotions. If you feel any emotions that come up as you look at the object, notice that too. And it's very common for the first feelings that come up to be either sadness, anger, or grief at how difficult it is to connect. It's not healthy to ignore these altogether, so don't ignore them. You can acknowledge them, but write it down in one word only, and then return to observing the object. So you want to avoid this internal spiral of grief and like maybe going into the philosophical rumination moves. So yeah, one word only, return to it. And if you happen to notice sensations, then you can use that. I also included on the website a list of words of sensations. So a lot of people have trouble differentiating feelings from sensations. Feelings are the ones you usually think of when talking about emotions, like feeling sad or anxious or angry, stuff like that. But sensations are more about how they affect the body. So I'm gonna try sharing this. Let's hope I do it right. And yeah, so I included this example here. It's just like sensations moving through the body. So it can feel heavy in your shoulders. It's usually in a specific area of your body. Heavy in your shoulders, nauseous in your stomach, dizzy in your head, tense in your legs, stuff like that. So again, don't focus on this too much if you're not feeling anything, but if you happen to, write it down. And then returning to the activity after this. I also included a little square if you're an artist or something. You can try drawing out the object you're observing in as accurate detail as you can, or you can collect little things that maybe you feel moments of connection to. This is what I did. I have a journal and I have leaves and flowers and stuff that I took. Again, only if you're allowed. If you're in like a museum or something, don't take the paintings. So yeah, use your judgment depending on how you use this, but I included it just in case. So the idea is to do this often, a few times a week, and then ideally moving up as it becomes a little less scary. I do recommend that you write it out the first few times. You can get to the place that you're not doing that anymore, like, but it is best just to kind of make it a habit to write it down for the first few times. Because for example, I did this exercise for years and I wrote it down a lot at the beginning, but now even when I go on walks now, I still find myself going through this checklist of integrating into the surroundings and of noticing the physical details. And that's the point you want to get to, because I haven't been in my episode for about 7 to 8 years now, but I still go through this, and that's where you want to get. Yeah, so I hope this is helpful. You can print it out if you have a printer, write it out. If not, you can just write prompts for yourself in a journal and take it with you. And Yeah. All right, so now I'm going to talk about resources, tips for finding resources. So obviously the ideal situation is if you can find a therapist or psychologist or psychiatrist who specializes in dissociation. So really quick, the differences between everything I just said is a therapist can help you talk about what you're going through and help so okay, I'm going to work backwards because I think that's an easier way to do it. Psychiatrists diagnose psychiatrists provide medication. So if you want to find out more information about medication, doctors and psychiatrists are the one to go to. Psychologists can't prescribe medication, but they diagnose. So they might be able to diagnose you with depersonalization, derealization, if that's something you're looking for. And they also can help give therapeutic treatment. And then therapists or counselors just give therapeutic treatment. So we can't diagnose, but we can still work with your symptoms and provide treatment in similar ways as psychologists. Yes. So finding someone who specializes in dissociation is the best bet. This is just done, as you would imagine, just Googling like your city or your town and therapists dissociation, see if anyone comes up. If they don't, psychologytoday.com is a good place to find private therapists. Private therapists are often paid for through insurance companies, so you can just check if you're working, you can check with your insurance company to see if they cover the licensing with where you are. I'm in Vancouver, Canada, so the licensing is usually RCC, Registered Clinical Counselor, or CCC, Canadian Certified Counselor. So you can pay through insurance or pay out of pocket if you have the means. And on Psychology Today, if you go to the website, you can click filters and then check off boxes that apply to you. There isn't a dissociation check, but there's other checks that are common in like dissociation circles that you can click. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. There's one depersonalization clinic in the world that I know of. There might be more, I don't know everything, but it's in London, the depersonalizationclinic.com. You can look that up and reach out to that person for services. It's the same person who did the study about the cognitive behavioral therapy that was quite effective that I talked about earlier. So if there's no dissociation specialist where you live and you can still, you're still looking for private therapy, private treatment, other words that you can check off, like in Psychology Today or just look up, is trauma. So most people who are trained in trauma and processing trauma know about depersonalization. Depending on your experience, there might be a lot, like you might really want to work through traumatic memories and traumatic experiences as well. So looking up a trauma specialist for that. Other kind of common approaches with trauma are EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. That's been recognized as very effective for treating traumatic memories and kind of getting so trauma gets stuck in your body, and then it can lead to all sorts of things, including depersonalization. So that can help process the experience. So which could affect your experience of DPDR, and also finding therapists who are trained in CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. That's the mode of therapy that was so effective with in the one study that I talked about. So yeah, to summarize, good keywords to look for in your area is trauma, EMDR, and CBT, and obviously dissociation if there's options. So that's all if you have insurance or have the means to pay for therapy. If you don't, some cities, provinces, countries have free programs for trauma therapy, so you can look that up. A lot of places also have services for system navigation. So if you're like totally lost, trying to see where to where to reach out to for help and not knowing how to navigate all this stuff, because it's a lot of information I'm giving you. If you don't know how to reach out, you can Google words like system navigator in your city, or a peer navigator, care navigator, and sometimes there's a free service where people can help you narrow down all these options and find something that works for you. If you don't have that, you can go to libraries. You don't need to have a library card to ask about services that are available, like mental health services. And when they give you information, you can look for some of those keywords that I just talked about. And also, a lot of places have low-cost counseling that is implemented by people who are like training to get their master's degrees or to get their qualifications, depending on where you are. They kind of vary. But yeah, these can be cheaper or free. And even if you live somewhere and there's no one who specializes in dissociation or any of these things, it seems harder to believe that people wouldn't specialize in trauma, but some places, like some people live in really small towns and there's very few services. So if there's none of these available, but there's still counseling available, I still recommend it. Like if nothing else, just because the experience of going through prolonged DPDR episodes is so isolating already, and it involves like retreating into yourself so much, that just going through the therapeutic interaction can be super, super effective. So I still really encourage it. Yeah, that's mostly what I have in my post. I may have even said more in here than I did in my post, because I kind of ad-libbed. But I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, you can email me. You can go to my website, which is www.lakeandglade.com, LAKEANDGLADE.com. My contact info is there. If you have questions about finding resources in your area, I'm happy to help. If you live in Canada, maybe I'd be able to help you as well personally for treatment, but I still wanted to make this video because I know that a lot of people don't really know where to turn. So I hope that some of these things were helpful. All right, thank you.